Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get straight to the core ideas shaping history and thought. Today, we're doing a really intensive exploration into the intellectual foundations of early Islamic civilization. Specifically, how did they even think about knowledge? How did scholars, right at the beginning of the Islamic State, figure out how to structure knowledge, how to verify it, blending, their own revelation with all this wisdom they were inheriting?
That's the core question, isn't it? Our mission today is really about methodology. We're digging into the epistemic guidelines, the actual rules they set up for what counts as truth, what makes knowledge valid. And it's not just a history lesson. It's about tracking this fascinating convergence between the Qur'an's directives, ethical, logical, and the huge legacy of Greek philosophy they encountered. The outcome? Well, it was a surprisingly rigorous, almost modern approach that really championed empirical evidence and, importantly, skepticism.
And what always strikes me is that this wasn't some slow academic evolution. The need for this kind of rigor, this philosophy of knowledge, it popped up immediately, right after the prophet passed away. Suddenly, the community faced this huge task. How do we secure knowledge? This thing they called ilm. How do we trust our sources? Before tackling the big scientific questions, they had to figure out trust. So let's start right there. What was that very first, most fundamental step they took to build this intellectual standard?
Okay, yeah. That first crucial step was establishing a really rigorous standard for historiography. And the first place they applied it, the test case, if you will, was the codification of the Qur'an itself. Now, this might sound like just a religious or historical task, but the way they did it set this major precedent for scientific methodology, for evidence gathering across the board.
Okay, let's unpack that because it sounds foundational. Preserving the Qur'an was job number one for the early caliphs, Abu Bakr, then Uthman refining it. Our sources really stress this wasn't just collecting text, it was a huge achievement in, methodological discipline.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is that the whole compilation process, it actually followed the Qur'an's own guidelines about how you establish facts using witnesses. This became the template, the early standard for evidence and verification that then, spilled over into everything else. Law, history, eventually science. Think of it like the world's first major peer review and documentation protocol, baked in right at the start.
Okay, walk us through the actual mechanics, because the details you mentioned sound incredibly strict, very focused on objectivity.
They really were. So Caliph Abu Bakr gives the job to Zayd ibn Thabit. He'd been the prophet's main scribe, so he knew the process. But his instructions were crystal clear. He wasn't supposed to rely just on memory, not even the memory of the most respected companions who had memorized the entire thing. No. His job was to compile the text strictly from written verses.
Written verses, so things physically written down during the prophet's lifetime.
Precisely. The physical artifact, the written evidence, was the primary source. That was non-negotiable.
But just finding a piece of parchment wasn't enough, right?
Absolutely not. That written piece had to meet a really high burden of proof. Each written verse, to be included, needed the testimony of two witnesses. And here's the critical detail.
Right.
These weren't just people saying, yeah, I heard that verse.
Right.
No, they had to be witnesses to the actual act of that verse being written down to the prophet's dictation.
Wow. Okay, wait. So they needed two people who could swear they saw that specific piece being written while the prophet dictated it.
Exactly that. It established an undisputed chain of custody, provenance. They knew where that written word came from, directly linked to the prophet.
That's an immense level of rigor. They weren't just authenticating the text, but the creation of the physical document itself through multiple independent people.
You got it. The written verses, verified this way, were the primary evidence. Full stop.
So where did all that famous memorization fit in? The Hafaz who knew it by heart.
Good question. Memory played a crucial but secondary role. Memorized versions served only to reaffirm the written evidence. Think of it like a cross-check. If a memorized version contradicted a properly witnessed written verse, it could be used to discount that written evidence, maybe flag it for more investigation.
Okay.
But crucially, memory alone could not be the primary evidence itself. It couldn't substitute for the written, witnessed document.
So memory checks the written proof, but the gold standard is the physical document, verified by multiple objective witnesses to its origin.
Precisely. And this established a core principle. Human memory, even the best memory, is fallible. Documented, objectively verifiable evidence, confirmed by multiple sources, that was the standard for truth.
That must have been quite a shift, especially coming from a culture with such a strong oral tradition. Why wasn't the word of a single highly respected companion enough?
Well, it speaks directly to that point about fallibility, doesn't it? Even among the most pious. The goal wasn't just accuracy, it was certainty. Absolute certainty about the source text. By demanding two witnesses for the provenance of the physical document, they were basically acknowledging that the methodology had to be stronger than any single individual, no matter how revered.
So the system had to be robust enough to account for potential human error, even unintentional error.
Exactly. And this structure, demanding physical proof, objective evidence, confirmed by multiple sources, it created this culture of evidence. That became the bedrock for historical authenticity, for legal judgments, and down the line for scientific investigation too.
So the very act of securing the foundational text of the faith simultaneously laid the blueprint for scientific verification. They treated it like historiography with intense scrutiny.
The objective was crystal clear. Find the truth, preserve the truth, and do it in a way that's demonstrably reliable. They weren't just collecting verses. They were authenticating, validating, creating a system. And in this process, it really created a professional class of scholars. You could almost call them the proto-scientists of transmission, whose whole expertise was built on this methodology. Cross-checking, documentation, demanding proof.
Okay, that establishes an incredibly high bar for source material and documentation. Now let's shift gears slightly. Beyond just the process of collecting texts, the Qur'an itself contains direct philosophical instructions, right? Mandates about how to engage with the physical world. And these mandates, they sound surprisingly, well, empirical, like the foundations of modern science.
Yeah, this is where we move from sort of the history of documents to the epistemology of the world around us. Yeah. How do we know things through our senses? And you're right, the Quran doesn't just valorize abstract thought. It explicitly commands accurate, verifiable measurement. Take that famous verse, give full measure, and weigh with a balance that is straight, 17.35.
Now, I've usually heard that verse discussed in terms of, fair trade, business ethics, don't cheat your customers. How does that jump to science?
Well, think about the underlying principle. It establishes the metaphysical importance of precision, accuracy. If God commands you to be precise when weighing, say, dates in the marketplace, then surely that same principle of precision must apply when you're trying to measure the distance to a star or the properties of a chemical reaction. It fundamentally links the ethical duty of justice to the intellectual or scientific duty of accurate observation.
So meticulous measurement becomes a virtue in itself, mandated by revelation.
Exactly. And it's not just about measurement. It's immediately paired with this really crucial instruction about how we process all information, basically forbidding intellectual laziness or just accepting things blindly. You mentioned Surah Al-Isra, verse 17.36.
Yeah, that one seems key. And pursue not that of which thou hast no knowledge, for every act of hearing or of seeing or of feeling in the heart will be inquired into. It sounds like a roadmap for knowing.
It really is. It outlines the whole epistemic process step by step and ties it directly to accountability, to responsibility.
So break down those channels it mentions. Hearing, seeing, feeling in the heart.
Okay, so hearing, that's the channel for external information. Things you're told, reports, traditions, basically data coming from others. Seeing is your direct empirical observation, what your own senses tell you about the world. Those are the raw inputs, you could say.
Right, the data streams.
Then you have the feeling in the heart. Now, heart here, fuad, isn't just emotion. It's generally understood as the seat of intellect, understanding, inner conviction. This is the processing center. It's where you take the data from hearing and seeing, you apply reason, you analyze it, you synthesize it, and you arrive at a conclusion, a belief, Sienna.
So the core principle is, don't jump to conclusions, don't form a belief, don't act on something if it hasn't gone through that verification process within your own intellect. You're responsible for checking what you hear, verifying what you see, and thinking it through.
Precisely. You are accountable for the entire chain. Input, processing, output, belief, action. And this really pushed back against some aspects of the Greek tradition they inherited.
How so? The Greeks were masters of logic, weren't they?
Absolutely, masters of logic, syllogism, deduction. But our sources suggest, in many areas, especially relating to the natural world, they sometimes prioritize these elegant philosophical systems over, say, messy experimentation. Sometimes the logic became a bit self-contained, detached from empirical testing. The Quranic mandate, however, forces you toward sensory verification. It makes empirical checking a necessity, not just an option.
And later scholars, like Al-Ghazali, really connected these dots, didn't he? Showing how trade and astronomy weren't so different methodologically.
He did. He used this brilliant analogy. He connected the principles needed for religious sciences, like law, with the principles needed for fair business, and showed they both rely on verifiable measurement systems. He specifically used the astrolabe as an example. He argued, look, the principles you use with an astrolabe to measure the stars' angles, geometry, careful observation, they are fundamentally the same principles of experiment and those of the senses that you use for weighing gold accurately in the market.
That's powerful. He's saying the divine command for accuracy applies everywhere, whether you're doing commerce or cosmology.
Exactly. He's demonstrating that empirical accuracy isn't just a scientific tool. It's an ethical and religious mandate. It elevates the act of measurement and observation.
So putting it all together, the universe itself, the physical world, nature is presented as a source of knowledge, but only if you observe it correctly, systematically.
Yes, the Qur'an is full of verses calling on people to observe the heavens, the earth, the cycle of rain, ships sailing, life and death, calling these things ayat, signs for a people that are wise, 2.164, or variations of that.
So observation isn't passive, it's an active intellectual and spiritual duty.
Right. It creates this expectation that a scholar, a believer, must engage with reality, must build tools, must measure, must verify. Because the universe itself is testifying, demanding to be understood through rigorous inquiry, this becomes absolutely foundational for the development of Islamic science.
Okay, so we have this mandate for systematic observation, for empirical grounding. Building right on top of that, the Quran also seems to explicitly warn against just passively accepting things, against intellectual laziness, which brings us to skepticism.
Yes, skepticism isn't just permitted. It's practically hardwired into the methodology as an ethical command. You see it clearly in that injunction to verify information from Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 49.6. O you who have believed, if there comes to you a disobedient one with information, investigate.
Lest you harm a people out of ignorance and become, over what you have done, regretful. That's a remarkably practical instruction. It puts the responsibility squarely on the receiver of information. Check your sources. Verify.
It's huge. It's a fundamental command, both ethical, don't cause harm, through ignorance, and epistemological. Establish the truth before you act or believe. It demands active investigation, tabayan or tafhabit, precisely because human sources can be unreliable, biased, or just plain wrong.
And this duty to investigate, it links directly to the philosophical idea of verification, doesn't it? The whole process of actually proving a claim.
Absolutely. That burden of proof, demanding evidence from the claimant, is captured perfectly in that constant Quranic challenge repeated again and again. Say, bring your proof if you are truthful.
Burhan, that specific word for proof.
Yes, burhan. It implies demonstrable, verifiable proof, often logical, often empirical. It's not just asking for an opinion, it's asking for evidence. And this treats verification and implicitly falsification as two sides of the same critical coin. You have to be able to support your claim, and it has to withstand scrutiny.
Okay, this idea of demanding proof and avoiding blind following sounds good in theory, but can we see it applied in practice? Like in a real-world system?
Yes, and the sources give a really compelling example. Judicial skepticism in the classical Sunni schools of law, the fiqh. This shows that this high-level epistemology wasn't just confined to philosophy seminars. It shaped legal procedures.
How did that work? What did judicial skepticism look like?
Well, the jurors displayed what the sources rightly call strong epistemological skepticism. Basically, the legal system was designed to make proving guilt, especially for serious charges, incredibly difficult.
A high burden of proof, essentially.
Extremely high. They demanded multiple, independent, and corroborating forms of evidence. Things like a voluntary confession or testimony from multiple credible witnesses, often 2, sometimes 4, depending on the case. And these witnesses had to be known for their upright character, untainted, or sometimes a formal oath.
So getting a conviction wasn't easy. It protected the accused.
Hugely. The complexity was designed to raise the bar for certainty to an extraordinary level, precisely to protect the integrity of the judicial decision and prevent wrongful convictions.
And the most striking example of this skepticism, according to the sources, relates to confessions obtained under duress.
Yes, this is really the ultimate proof of their methodological rigor. The sources are explicit. A confession obtained through torture, coercion, threats, any form of duress is completely invalid. Thrown out.
Why? I mean, the person confessed, didn't they?
Because the method of obtaining the confession tainted the evidence. Torture, they argue, destroys the credibility of the utterance. The source of the statement is compromised, unreliable. Therefore, the information itself, the confession, is deemed unreliable, regardless of whether it might actually be true.
Wow, that's basically implying the scientific principle of needing untainted data to legal evidence. The method matters as much as the result.
Exactly. They understood, implicitly or explicitly, that the reliability of the evidence is paramount. You can't trust data or testimony obtained under conditions that destroy credibility.
So the source of the information had to be reliable.
Absolutely. This rejection of coerced evidence, this focus on the reliability of the source, even under extreme pressure, shows an incredibly high, practically applied standard of skepticism within the legal system itself. It's a direct parallel to the scientific demand for verifiable, untainted results.
So the formal, almost ritualistic procedures in court weren't just tradition, they were epistemological safeguards.
That's a great way to put it. Safeguards ensuring the judge ruled only on verifiable, untainted evidence. It's essentially scientific methodology applied to justice.
And the underlying assumption here seems to be
That human knowledge is inherently fallible,
Yeah.
prone to error. Therefore, all claimants, regardless of who they are, even if they're claiming religious truth, have to be ready to provide their burhan, their proof.
this willingness to challenge, to demand burhan, even from established authorities or traditions, that's the engine of scientific progress, isn't it? You can't just rely on because so-and-so said so.
Exactly. And you see this rigorous, skeptical demand for verifiable proof reach its zenith in later figures. The physicist Ibn al-Haytham is the classic example. He absolutely embodies this methodological skepticism.
Yeah.
He famously refused to just accept the theories of the ancients, particularly Ptolemy on optics and astronomy. And Ptolemy had been the authority for, 1,000 years?
Right. Challenging Ptolemy was huge. But if he was so critical, why even bother starting with the Greeks? Why not just, invent optics from scratch? What did starting with Ptolemy give him if he was just going to critique it?
That's a really insightful question. The advantage was structure, efficiency. The Greeks, especially Ptolemy, provided a comprehensive system, an architecture for thinking about vision and the cosmos, even if parts of it turned out to be flawed. Ibn al-Haytham wasn't throwing out the baby with the bathwater. He used their geometric rigor, their framework, as his starting point, but then he applied the Burhan methodology to it. He was essentially conducting a massive peer review of centuries of accepted science.
So he used their tools but checked their work.
Precisely. And his critiques weren't just philosophical hand-waving. He pointed out specific mathematical inconsistencies, physical impossibilities based on observation.
Can you give a concrete example? How did he apply this skepticism in practice?
Okay, the classic one is his work on vision, Ptolemy, Euclid. The consensus view was the emission theory, that the eye sends out rays like invisible feelers that hit objects and allow us to see. Ibn al-Haytham applied methodical skepticism. He thought, okay, if the eye emits rays, why does looking at a bright light, like the sun, cause pain? Shouldn't the eye be used to emitting things? Why can we see the stars instantly? Wouldn't it take time for rays to travel that far?
Obvious questions, maybe, but ones that challenged the core theory.
Right, and he didn't stop there. He did detailed anatomical studies of the eye, used geometry, observed light refraction. He concluded the opposite. Light enters the eye from objects. The intromission theory. But the key wasn't just proposing a new idea, it was that he systematically falsified the old one by demanding proof, Burhan, that aligned with sensory experience, mathematics, and physical reality. He didn't just disagree, he demonstrated why the old theory couldn't be true based on evidence. Pure Burhan in action.
Okay, this is where things get really intricate and fascinating. The concept of taqlid. It's often just translated as blind imitation, but it seems much more complex than that. It became this major battleground, defining the line between faith, reason, and accepting authority in different fields.
It absolutely did. And blind imitation is often too simplistic, yeah. Fundamentally, taqlid means following the opinion of someone whose proof, whose burhan, isn't evident to you. You're taking their word for it. Now, whether that's okay or not, its status ethically and intellectually depends entirely on the context. The scholars hammered out this really crucial, nuanced distinction, basically. Taqlid in law, generally encouraged, even necessary. Taqlid in theology, aqida, or science, generally rejected, especially for scholars.
Right. Let's break that down. Start with law, jurisprudence. Our sources say taqlid there wasn't just okay, it was actively encouraged, even necessary for society to function. Why?
It boils down to practicality and expertise. For the average person, the layman, who needs to know how to pray correctly, conduct business legally, follow family law. Taqlid is essential. The Qur'an itself directs people. Ask the people of remembrance, the scholars, if you know not, 16.43, and also follow the messenger and those of authority amongst you, 4.59. The logic is pretty straightforward. Not everyone can be a master juris of facie.
It would be impossible. Society would grind to a halt if everyone had to derive every single legal ruling from scratch themselves.
Exactly, you need specialists. So the layperson defers to the expert, the fuqaha, who have dedicated their lives to studying the sources, the hadith, the principles of jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh. They have the specialized knowledge.
So it's like going to a doctor or an engineer. You trust their expertise because you don't have the time or training to become an expert yourself, just to follow their advice. You don't need to understand the pharmacology to take the medicine.
That's a perfect analogy. You don't need to grasp the complex legal reasoning, the chains of narration, the debates among scholars about a specific ruling in order to be expected to follow that ruling. The jurist provides the prescription. And think about the rapidly expanding Islamic state, new cultures, languages, millions of converts. This principle of deferring to qualified legal experts was absolutely vital for maintaining order and consistency.
Okay, that makes sense for law as a practical necessity. But the acceptance of authority clearly has limits. Why is Taqlid rejected, or at least heavily frowned upon, in theology, Aqidah, core beliefs, and in science?
Because belief and scientific understanding demand something more than just obedience or deference. They require internal understanding and intellectual commitment. That's the fundamental difference. You can comply with a law you don't fully understand. But can you truly believe a theological doctrine if you have no idea what it means or why it's supposed to be true?
Probably not. It seems like you'd just be repeating words.
Exactly. If someone claims to hold, say, a very complex Asherite theological position on divine attributes, but they can't explain it, they don't understand the arguments for or against it, what they actually believe in.
They believe the scholar who told them it was true.
Precisely. They believe in the person they are following. Their belief is placed in the trustworthiness of that imam or scholar, not in the doctrine itself. It becomes an act of trust, maybe social conformity, but not a genuine intellectual commitment to the belief itself.
So it's a category error. They think they believe the doctrine, but their actual operative belief is Imam X is reliable.
You've nailed it. And because genuine belief, iman, requires understanding and conviction, the scholars concluded that Taqlid, just blindly following someone else's theological conclusions without understanding, is not a valid path to true faith. You have to grasp it, at least at some basic level, for it to be your belief.
That's a really high standard for belief. It demands active intellectual engagement from everyone, not just scholars.
It does. It implies that faith isn't passive acceptance. It requires effort, thought, understanding.
Okay, so no Taqlid in core beliefs. What about science? How does it apply there, especially for the scholar?
Well, for the layman, Taqlid science is generally fine, even necessary. You trust the physicist who explains gravity. You trust the doctor about vaccines. You trust the engineer who designed the bridge you drive over. You're deferring to expertise outside your own.
Right, same logic as law, practical deference.
But for the scientist, the scholar working within their own field, Taqlid is a major problem. It's discouraged, seen as intellectual stagnation. A physicist cannot simply say, I believe in string theory because Witten says so. They have to understand the math, the evidence, the arguments. They have to engage with the Burhan.
They have a responsibility to investigate and verify within their own domain of expertise.
Absolutely. They can't just inherit conclusions from their predecessors, not even from giants like Aristotle or Ptolemy, without critical examination. That's the legacy of Ibn al-Haytham, right? Challenge, verify, demand proof.
And this distinction, this tension over when Taqlid is acceptable, it led to some pretty serious internal debates within the Islamic intellectual tradition itself, especially regarding the Greek influence.
Oh, definitely. This became a major point of contention. You had scholars influenced by the Asherite theological school, who were often quite critical of those influenced by the Peripatetic or Aristotelian school, like Ibn Sina, Avicenna. The charge they often leveled was exactly this: that the Peripatetics were committing Taqlid in science and philosophy by following the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, too closely, too uncritically.
What was the specific danger they saw in that? What were they afraid of?
They were worried that by adopting the Greek scientific or philosophical framework wholesale, the Peripatetics were inadvertently importing Greek metaphysical assumptions, ontological commitments about the nature of reality, God, creation, that weren't actually necessary for the science itself, but which potentially contradicted core Islamic theological principles.
Like the idea of the world being eternal, not created, or those Neoplatonic emanations instead of active creation.
Exactly those kinds of things. The Greek philosophical package often came bundled with ideas like an uncreated eternal cosmos, or a prime mover that acts necessarily rather than through free will, or
Right.
these complex hierarchies of passive emanations. The Asherite-influenced thinkers were saying, wait a minute, use the Greek logic, use their mathematics, use their observations. Those are valuable tools. But be careful not to blindly accept the underlying philosophical worldview that comes with them, especially when it clashes with the revelation.
So the critique was essentially, stop committing taclit of Greek metaphysics. Separate the useful scientific method from the potentially problematic philosophical dogma.
That's the heart of it. It was a call for intellectual independence, for ensuring that the adoption of foreign knowledge didn't lead to the erosion of their own theological foundations. Use the tools, but don't adopt the foreign ontology uncritically.
And interestingly, you pointed out that the concepts of taqlid, deferring to authority, and skepticism, investigation, are sometimes linked even within the Qur'an itself.
Yes, verse 4.83 is fascinating in this regard. It speaks about referring important matters back to the messenger and those in authority, uli and sir. That sounds like taqlid, right? Deferring to experts or leaders. But the verse immediately continues by saying that those who can extract the knowledge, yasnan betuner, from the matter should investigate it. So the referral to authority is directly coupled with the necessity for critical investigation and extraction of truth by those capable. It shows that even legitimate authority needs to be paired with scrutiny, not blind acceptance.
Okay, so Muslims developed this really robust, internally consistent epistemic framework based on verification, empiricism, skepticism, and this nuanced view of authority in taqlid. But as we've touched on, they weren't operating in a vacuum. They inherited this colossal intellectual estate from the Greeks. How did they grapple with that?
That grappling, that intersection, is really the crucible where much of Islamic philosophy and science was forged. They inherited not just Aristotle, not just Plato, but the whole sweep of Hellenistic thought, Stoicism, Pythagoreanism, and especially Neoplatonism, which was itself this complex blend. This wasn't a minor influence. It was a flood of knowledge coming from established centers like Alexandria, Jundashopur, and elsewhere.
And the mechanism for this transfer was the legendary translation movement centered in Baghdad.
Yes, absolutely. Starting mainly in the 8th century under the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad, particularly institutions like the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, became this unprecedented hub. Scholars, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Sabian, Zoroastrian worked together, translating Greek texts on medicine, math, astronomy, logic, philosophy, alchemy, everything, mostly from Syriac and Greek into Arabic.
It must have been an incredibly exciting, but maybe also unsettling time. What was the general feeling about this massive influx of foreign, non-Islamic knowledge?
Well, mixed is putting it mildly. It was hugely contentious. On one hand, you had caliphs like Al-Amun actively sponsoring it, seeing it as valuable knowledge. On the other hand, many conservative theologians and legal scholars were deeply suspicious, even hostile.
Why the suspicion? What was the main fear?
They saw it as potentially dangerous, fitna, discord or corruption. They feared that these foreign philosophies, often originating from polytheistic or pagan Greek culture, could dilute Islamic beliefs, challenge the authority of the Qur'an and Sunnah, or lead people astray. Remember, many of these Greek texts came with worldviews that lacked concepts central to Islam, like creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, by an active, willful God.
So what was the single biggest philosophical challenge, the main point of friction that the Greek inheritance posed?
As we touched on with taqlid, it really centered on the metaphysical baggage. The core conflict kept coming back to fundamental questions about the nature of God and creation. The big one was the eternity of the world. Many Aristotelian and Neoplatonic systems required, or at least strongly implied, that the universe was uncreated and co-eternal with the divine. It wasn't made in time, it always existed.
Which directly contradicts the Quranic account of creation.
Directly. For Orthodox Islamic theology, God creates the world through his will and command. Kun fayakun, be, and it is. An eternal, uncreated world was a non-starter theologically.
It sounds like adopting Greek cosmology to explain how the planets move could inadvertently lead you to adopt the Greek idea that the whole system wasn't created in the first place. A philosophical Trojan horse.
That's a good way to put it. And the Neoplatonic ideas were particularly tricky. Their model often involved the cosmos emanating necessarily and passively from the one or the divine intellect through these cascading levels of being. This idea of passive, necessary emanation felt very different from the Islamic conception of a God who acts freely, chooses commands, and interacts directly with his creation. So Integrating Greek logic or science always carried this risk of implicitly importing these fundamentally different ontological commitments about how reality works.
Amidst this conflict, how did key figures like Al-Farabi navigate it? He's seen as crucial in transmitting Aristotle.
Al-Farabi is fascinating. He was a central figure in establishing the Islamic peripatetic Aristotelian school. He was a master synthesizer. His approach was to champion the methodology of the Greeks, especially Aristotelian logic, and its application to political science and ethics. He saw logic as a universal tool. But he also worked very hard to try and harmonize, or, where necessary, modify the Greek framework to reduce the direct clashes with Islamic theology. He tried to strip out some of the most problematic metaphysical elements, or reinterpret them in ways that were less contradictory to revelation, like on the issue of creation.
So he was trying to keep the logical engine, but perhaps change the philosophical fuel.
Something like that. He aimed to make Aristotle's system accessible and usable for Muslim thinkers. His work became incredibly influential, providing the foundation for later giants like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who continued this project of integrating Greek philosophy, though the underlying tensions over metaphysics, over taclet of Greek ideas, never fully went away. They remained a dynamic debate. Hashtag, tag out, trap out.
So reflecting on all this, we've really seen how the foundations of knowledge in early Islamic scholarship were built on this incredibly demanding, multi-layered methodology. It started with extreme rigor in preserving source texts, demanding written evidence confirmed by witnesses. Then, drawing from the Qur'an, it championed empiricism measures accurately, observed carefully. It mandated skepticism, investigate claims, demand proof, the Burhan. And it developed this really sophisticated understanding of authority through taqlid, knowing when deference to experts is necessary, like in law, but rejecting blind imitation, especially in core beliefs and for scholars in their own scientific fields.
Absolutely. And that central tension, that ongoing intellectual effort to harness the powerful logical and scientific tools inherited from the Greeks, while remaining steadfastly anchored to revelation specifically, avoiding the trap of taqlid, of blindly imitating foreign metaphysical assumptions that really defines so much of the intellectual energy of the era. And understanding this history, this philosophy of science in action, is still incredibly relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. So wrapping this up, what's the key takeaway for you listening to this deep dive? What does it mean when you encounter information in your own life?
I think the fundamental lesson is timeless. The pursuit of genuine knowledge, ilm, requires more than just absorbing facts. It demands a conscious methodology. It requires critical engagement with sources, a willingness to question, a demand for evidence, and a clear understanding of when and why you accept authority. It reminds us that knowledge isn't passive. It comes with the responsibility to verify, to understand, to strive for truth based on proof.
A powerful reminder about intellectual responsibility.
And maybe here's a final thought to leave you with, something provocative. Think about that Asherite critique we discussed, accusing the peripatetics of committing taqlid by following Greek thought too closely, importing metaphysical baggage unintentionally. Now, fast forward to today. Western science and its underlying philosophical assumptions often dominate the global discourse. So the question flips, doesn't it? How careful do we need to be today when engaging with dominant scientific paradigms from, say, a foreign worldview? How do we use the powerful tools of modern science without inadvertently making ontological commitments, adopting underlying assumptions about reality, consciousness, purpose that might not be necessary for the science itself, but just come packaged with the current cultural framework? That challenge of avoiding taqlid, of critically separating method from metaphysics, is arguably just as relevant now as it was for Al-Ghazali or Ibn al-Haytham. Something to definitely think about the next time you encounter a new scientific claim presented as absolute objective truth.
But even with that, they needed ways to organize all this knowledge, to structure their investigations. And that brings us to how they mapped the world of knowledge, and eventually to the Greeks. But first, how did they think about knowledge itself?
Well, a core concept was the unity of knowledge, or ilm. Grounded in their monotheistic worldview, they generally believed that all knowledge ultimately comes from the one divine source, even if it manifests in different disciplines.
So science and religion weren't necessarily seen as separate domains?
Not fundamentally, though the relationship was complex and debated, but the idea was a single body of truth, ilm. And because of this, scholars put a huge amount of effort into classifying the different branches of knowledge, figuring out how they related to each other.
We see these elaborate classification systems from figures like Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Qutb al-Din al-Shirazi. What do these classifications tell us about their priorities?
They reveal a lot, actually, especially about that central tension, the relationship between human reason and divine revelation. Well, all classifications generally distinguish between, say, intellectual or rational sciences like logic, math, physics, metaphysics, and religious or transmitted sciences like Quranic studies, hadith, prophetic traditions, jurisprudence.
Okay, that seems straightforward.
But the hierarchy between them and the relative power assigned to reason versus revelation, that's where the big debates happened. Which one has the final say? Which provides the ultimate framework?
Right. The sources highlight two main, often competing views on this hierarchy. Let's start with Al-Farabi. He's associated with the Islamic peripatetic school, right? Following Aristotle.
Very much so. Al-Farabi deeply integrated Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, into his system. He had immense confidence in the power of human reason, perfected through logic and philosophy.
So where did reason sit in his hierarchy?
Pretty high up. In Al-Farabi's view, philosophy, as the highest form of rational inquiry, often provided the ultimate framework for understanding reality. Theology and revelation were important, of course, but philosophy could, in a sense, interpret or provide the deeper meaning behind revelation. Reason was given a very wide scope.
So philosophy could almost sit above theology in terms of explaining the world.
In some interpretations of his work, yes. It reduced the role of pure theology, making it more supportive rather than foundational in the grand scheme of knowledge. His approach really embraced the Greek methodological toolkit to push the boundaries of what reason could achieve.
Okay, that sounds quite rationalistic. How did the more orthodox view, like Al-Ghazali's, respond to that?
Well, Al-Ghazali represents the powerful counterargument, the view that became more dominant in Sunni orthodoxy. He put revelation, and specifically gnosis, mystical intuition, or direct experiential knowledge of God, often associated with Sufism, at the absolute pinnacle of the hierarchy.
And where did reason fit in for him?
Reason had a crucial but definitely subordinate role. It was essential for understanding the created world, for logic, for law, for checking the validity of transmissions. But it had limits, hard limits.
Limits set by revelation.
Exactly. Al-Ghazali famously wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, a major critique arguing that human reason simply cannot penetrate certain metaphysical questions on its own. Things like whether the world is eternal, the exact nature of the soul, bodily resurrection. These were matters of the unseen, the Gabe.
And only revelation could provide answers about the Gabe.
Correct. For Al-Ghazali, reason was a valuable tool given by God, but it had a specific domain. Trying to use philosophical reason to usurp the authority of Scripture on matters beyond its scope was dangerous and led to error, even heresy. He essentially walled off revelation's core truths from philosophical speculation. Reason supports faith. It doesn't judge it.
So he wasn't anti-reason, just anti-reason exceeding its God-given bounds.
Precisely. He recognized its immense value for logic, science, law. But he insisted it had to operate within the framework set by revelation. Revelation puts a cap on human reason, you could say.
This conflict, Al-Farabi's integrationist view versus Al-Ghazali's boundary-setting view, seems like a defining intellectual struggle.
It absolutely was. It shaped Islamic philosophy and theology for centuries. It's the core debate about how you synthesize faith and reason, internal truth, and external methods.
Speaking of external methods, let's turn directly to that massive influx, the Greek inheritance. You simply can't talk about this era without acknowledging the Greeks.
Impossible. They inherited a treasure trove. Logic, rhetoric, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and of course philosophy and theology. This provided the systematic tools, the structured approach, the vocabulary needed for advanced intellectual work.
Where and when did this transfer primarily happen?
The groundwork was laid during the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great, when Greek culture spread and mixed with Egyptian, Persian, Syriac, and other Near Eastern traditions. Ideas were already mingling.
But the big organized effort came later with the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Exactly. The real hub was Baghdad, especially after its founding around 750 AD. Under caliphs like al-Mansur, Harun al-Rashid, and particularly al-Mamun in the early 9th century, there was a massive state-sponsored effort, the translation movement.
Centered around the famous House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah.
That's the one. It wasn't just a library, it was a translation center, an academy, a research institute. They actively sought out manuscripts from everywhere.
Where were they getting them from?
All over. From the Byzantine Empire, from old Persian academies like Jinishapur, from monasteries in Syria and Iraq, remnants of Alexandria's libraries, eventually even from centers in Muslim Spain like Cordoba. It was a vast network.
This sounds like a monumental undertaking. Who did the actual work?
It was often multi-ethnic and multi-religious. Many key translators were Syriac-speaking Christians, like the famous Hunayn ibn Ishaq and his school. They knew Greek, Syriac, and Arabic. They didn't just translate word for word. They often had to create the technical Arabic vocabulary needed for complex philosophical and scientific concepts.
And they were translating everything.
Huge amounts. Galen and Hippocrates in medicine, Euclid and Ptolemy in math and astronomy, and critically Plato, Aristotle, and later Neoplatonist thinkers like Plotinus and Proclus in philosophy.
You mentioned Neoplatonism. Why is that distinction important? It wasn't just pure Plato and Aristotle they were getting.
Right. What they often received, especially in philosophy, was filtered through Neoplatonism. Thinkers like Plotinus, who actually taught in Egypt in the 3rd century, had created this grand synthesis. It took Plato's ideas about forms and the good, blended them with Aristotle's logic and physics, and added layers of mystical and hierarchical thought.
How did this Neoplatonic flavor influence Islamic thought specifically?
It had a massive impact on metaphysics and cosmology. The Neoplatonic idea of emanation, how the one, perfect God, could generate the multiplicity of the created world through a series of descending stages or intelligences, was incredibly influential.
It provided a framework for explaining creation.
Yes, a rational, structured way to think about how the universe flowed from God, often visualized as those celestial spheres, each corresponding to an emanation or a passive self-manifestation of the divine, as one source puts it. It helped bridge the gap between a transcendent God and the physical world.
And the rationalist theologians, the Metaphysics we mentioned earlier, they latched onto these Greek methods.
Absolutely. They embraced the Greek tools of dialectic, logic, and syllogistic reasoning wholeheartedly. They used Aristotelian logic and Neoplatonic metaphysics to build their theological arguments, to defend their doctrines rationally. The systematic way of reasoning and debating was perhaps the most crucial part of the Greek inheritance for them.
Which brings us back, again, to Al-Farabi. He seems central to integrating all this.
He really is. Known as the second teacher, Aristotle being the first, because he took this translated Greek corpus, particularly Aristotle, filtered through Neoplatonism, and systematically presented it to the Islamic world.
What was his main contribution?
Synthesis and methodology. He worked hard to reconcile apparent contradictions between Plato and Aristotle, often using that Neoplatonic framework. He emphasized logic, mantic, as the essential tool for all sciences. He didn't just pass on Greek knowledge, he organized it, commented on it, and established the Islamic peripatetic Aristotelian school of philosophy, building upon what the Greeks had done but making it usable for his context.
Okay, so he solidified the Greek methodological foundation.
Yes, he provided the structure and the tools that later thinkers, even those who disagreed with him like Al-Ghazali, would use to engage with, analyze, and ultimately critique the Greek legacy itself.
Which is the perfect lead-in to our next section, the fruits of this synthesis. What happens when you combine that internal Quranic demand for verification and skepticism with the external Greek logical framework?
You get something new, something powerful. You get the foundations, arguably, of the modern scientific method.
How so? What was the crucial step?
The crucial step wasn't just absorbing Greek knowledge, it was subjecting that knowledge to the rigorous interrogation demanded by their own intellectual tradition. Remember, ijtihad and the proof requirement.
Right. Don't just accept authority blindly.
Exactly. So scholars started building on Greek thought, but also critically testing it against observation, logic, and that internal demand for verifiable Burin. This gave rise to a more robust scientific skepticism, one rooted in experiment and observation, not just armchair reasoning.
And the star player here, the one often called the father of the modern scientific method, is Ibn al-Haytham.
Ibn al-Haytham,
Yes. Working in Cairo around the year 1000, he represents a fundamental shift. His work, especially in optics, was revolutionary, precisely because it was grounded so thoroughly in systematic, repeatable experiments.
Not just theory, but actual testing. Actual meticulous testing. He explicitly stated that human reason is fallible, prone to biases and errors, and therefore needs constant correction through empirical evidence. He laid out the essential steps: formulate a clear hypothesis, design experiments to test it, carefully record and verify the results, and then critically review your conclusions and be willing to revise them.
That sounds remarkably modern.
It really does. And the sources highlight his famous work, Shukuk al-Batlami's Doubts Concerning Ptolemy. This wasn't just a minor disagreement. It was a landmark challenge to the accepted astronomical authority for over 1,000 years.
Ptolemy's model of the cosmos, with the Earth at the center and planets on epicycles.
That's the one. And Ibn al-Haytham's critique wasn't just about minor inaccuracies. He applied that demand for Burhan, for demonstrable physical truth, to the entire model.
What was his main objection?
Ptolemy's model was mathematically brilliant for its time. It predicted planetary positions reasonably well. But to make the math work, Ptolemy had introduced mechanisms like eccentrics, epicycles, and especially the equant point, which described planetary motions that Ibn al-Haytham argued were physically impossible.
So the math worked, but the physical reality it implied didn't make sense.
Exactly. Ibn al-Haytham insisted that a scientific model couldn't just be mathematically convenient. It had to correspond to physical reality. He argued that the complex non-uniform motions required by Ptolemy's model couldn't possibly be how actual physical bodies in the heavens moved. There was a contradiction between the mathematical description and physical possibility.
He was demanding consistency between math and physics.
Yes, a cornerstone of modern science. He famously wrote about how truth is sought for its own sake, but that scientists are not infallible. Error creeps in. Therefore, the duty of the investigator is constant vigilance, criticism, and testing, even against the greatest authorities of the past.
That intellectual courage to challenge Ptolemy based on logical and physical inconsistency seems like a direct result of that anti-tack of the spirit we discussed.
Absolutely. It's ijtihad applied to cosmology. You cannot blindly follow Taklid, the great Ptolemy, if your own reason, ijtihad, and your understanding of physical reality show a fundamental flaw in his explanation. You have a duty to doubt, to investigate.
And this critical spirit fueled a broader debate about cosmology at the time.
Yes, a really vibrant debate. It wasn't simply science versus religion. Often it was theology combined with reason and observation, pushing back against aspects of the Greek philosophical models that seemed to lack solid proof or contradict physical sense.
Like Al-Ghazali's position.
Right. While Al-Ghazali defended revelation, he was also deeply skeptical of philosophers who built elaborate cosmological systems based purely on Aristotelian metaphysics without sufficient empirical backing. He argued, for example, that things like eclipses should only be accepted as scientifically understood after rigorous mathematical and astronomical proof left no room for doubt. You had to show your work, basically. Challenge the expert to prove their methodology.
And others use religious texts themselves to challenge the Greek models.
Yes, figures like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi in the 12th century famously argued that certain interpretations of Quranic verses actually contradicted the prevailing Greek idea of solid, crystalline celestial spheres carrying the planets.
The idea of hard shells in the heavens.
Exactly. Al-Razi suggested, based on his reading and reasoning, that the orbits might just be imaginary circles, not physical structures. This is a fantastic example of theology, combined with rational critique and the demand for physical plausibility, pushing back against an established scientific model inherited from the Greeks.
It's fascinating. The same tradition that eagerly translated and absorbed Greek science also provided the tools and the impetus to critique and ultimately move beyond it.
And this skepticism wasn't just among the theologians. Even Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, who was arguably the biggest champion of Aristotle in the Islamic West, expressed deep dissatisfaction with the state of astronomy.
What did he say?
He recognized the Ptolemaic model was useful for calculations, for predicting where planets would appear. But he doubted its physical reality. He famously quipped something like, "The astronomy of our time offers no truth, but only agrees with the calculations and not with what exists."
Wow. That perfectly sums up the problem. The math works, but it doesn't reflect reality. Skepticism about the accepted model, even from an Aristotelian.
Exactly. That pervasive demand for verification, for Burhan, for consistency between theory and physical reality, mandated by that internal intellectual engine, kept pushing the boundaries.
So we've really come full circle here. You have these internal demands from the Islamic tradition itself. Verify your claims, use your reason, don't blindly follow, observe carefully.
The imperative for ijtihad and Burhan.
Right. And then you have the external toolkit inherited from the Greeks, logic, mathematics, systematic philosophy, a vast body of existing knowledge.
The structure, the methodology.
And the fusion of these two is what created the fertile ground for this period of intense scientific and intellectual activity.
That synthesis is the real legacy, I think. It created this environment where demonstrable truth, Burhan, was prized above mere tradition or authority. They internalize this idea that human knowledge is inherently fallible and needs constant testing through critical thinking, ijtihad, and empirical proof. That fundamentally changed the game.
And understanding that intellectual toolkit, the commitment to verification, skepticism, ijtihad, that's arguably much more valuable for us today than just knowing they invented certain things.
I completely agree. It's about the process of knowledge.
Which leaves us with the final thought, something for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on. We talked a lot about how the crisis of Taqlid, of blind imitation, forced medieval scholars to demand proof, to engage in deep inquiry, to practice ijtihad. So think about today. We're drowning in information, right? There's constant pressure from expert consensus, social media feeds telling us what to think. So the question is, what modern phenomena, maybe social trends, political narratives, even scientific consensuses, are you potentially accepting through a kind of modern Taqlid? Where are you relying on authority rather than demanding the underlying reasoning, the ijtihad, the verifiable, untainted evidence for yourself? Something to consider.